Hello to all of you, good morning. I would like to start with two personal experiences. The first was in 2001. I was in Belgrade and I was asked to give a presentation on the Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe. Everyone liked that. Forward-looking, EU perspective, nice. There was someone else, that was Holm Sundhausen. He is actually the supervisor of my habilitation. He is very experienced in Balkan politics for I don't know how long, historian. And he was talking about the memorandum of 1986. Some of you might have heard about it. This was the crucial stepping stone, if you want so, into nationalist Serbia. This was the point where the SANU, the Academy of Sciences of Serbia, of Belgrade, announced its revisionist nationalist program. And he was openly discussing this with those people there. The people, the audience, were professors mainly from Humboldt Stiftung Foundation. All of them were exposed to Western culture for at least a year, having studied here, giving lectures, and so on. Actually, I couldn't believe the discussion. The discussion was mainly about what's the problem? We don't think that there is a problem with this memorandum. The memorandum was just fine. Yeah? So there was this kind of multiple truth that we talked about yesterday. Yeah? And for me, having studied for a long time this memorandum and the whole rise of nationalism in Serbia, this was kind of difficult to see how the discussion went. Second experience. 2009, a few years later, I was in Bosnia and I was interviewing people. My topic was secessionism, working on secessionism in Bosnia. And I was all over the place, visiting Sarajevo, visiting Pale, visiting Mostar. And in Mostar, and you have the picture of Mostar on your program, and we discussed Mostar yesterday already. In Mostar, I met one of the deans of the Croat University and interviewed him. At first, everything was nice. We talked about multi-ethnicity and everyone is willing to cooperate and so on. And then I digged a little bit deeper, and then things changed within the interview. What became obvious was a litany of accusations against the Muslims, or the Musulmans, as they were called by him. There were two people, was also the dean, the deputy dean. This is our land, a few quotes. This is our land. The Bosniaks, quote, suppress us. They act like the Osmanic Empire. What we experience is creeping Islamization. Look at all the mosques that are built here. They want to suppress the Croat language and flag. We are the losers of the whole process. We will lose everything at the end. And without a separate third entity of Bosnia, there are two entities at the moment, the Federation, the Bosniak Croat Federation and the Serb Federation, but no separate Croat Federation. Without a third entity, Bosnia will die. And there's just no war here because of NATO's presence. NATO needs to stay. Obviously, there was no trust at all among Muslims and Bosniaks and Croats, at least as seen from these two intellectuals. Some background, we have yesterday discussed it. The bridge was destroyed in 1993. The background was the war or the war within a war, what we called it. There was the Bosnian War, and within that was the war between the Bosniaks and the Croats. There was the Croat siege of Mostar, shelling the Bosniak quarter. There was a Bosniak quarter and a Croat quarter already at that time for 10 months. The bridge was rebuilt in 2004. There was a ceremony. At the ceremony, the Croat prime minister and president appeared. When it was re-established, this bridge, who did not appear was the Cardinal of Sarajevo and the Bishop of Mostar. Instead, they had by that time already erected a giant 100 feet high Jubilee cross. And you can see it here on the right-hand side up there, a huge cross above Mostar. Symbolizing that this is our land. It is illuminated at night. Mostar is still strongly divided. You heard it yesterday. There was a breakdown of the local government shortly after I left. We heard about this. For 2 years, no mayor because they couldn't agree. It's a power sharing system. The Croat flag is flying all over the place without the 5 crowns of the Croat krajinas. After that interview, I wanted to drive back to my hotel, which is in the Bosniak part. I asked a taxi driver to bring me home from the Croat part to the Bosniak part. He was slightly irritated. He didn't want to. Then he started. He drove over into the other part, and then he was completely lost. He didn't know his way. This is a small town. I don't know how many inhabitants. A small town. And what happened was that at some point of time he had to turn down the window and ask people where to go. He didn't know where to go. I asked him why, and he said, let me quote, what was the quote? I'm never on this side. I'm never on this side. Yeah. Okay, this left me pretty frustrated and puzzling. We are 15 years after the Washington Agreement, which ended the war between Bosniaks and Croats 1 year before Dayton. I was shocked, actually, about the level of interethnic tension, which, compared to the interviews with Serbs and Bosniaks outside Mostar, which I did, were rather tough. Bosniak-Croat relations seem to be worse than the relations between Bosniaks and Serbs. And this is in stark contrast to the international official policy, which claims success. We are leaving Bosnia, mission completed, let's move on. So where do we stand? 2 experiences. My question I want to ask here is, where do we stand with regard to reconciliation in the Balkans? 20 years after Dayton, 16 years after the Kosovo War, and 14 years after Ohrid. Has reconciliation failed? Do we need to reconsider our strategies? How do I want to proceed? I want to start with some personal caveats. Then I move to my understanding of reconciliation. Then I will give you some context factors which I think are important to understand the setting, the Balkan setting, and its implications for reconciliation. Afterwards, I talk about the main instruments used for reconciliation. I try to give you an overall assessment focusing on Bosnia, on Kosovo, and on Serbia. Talk about a few obstacles, main obstacles of reconciliation, and sum up. And I'll see how far I get. Maybe I have to skip some points. Okay, let's start with some caveats. I think I'm one of the only speakers who is not talking about his own country. You are the ones. Okay. But many of you are talking about your own countries, and this is difficult. Yeah. So please be a little bit careful. I'm not living in the Balkans. Some of your experiences might diverge from what I say. Just share this with us afterwards. Second point, reconciliation is a very fluid process. The change is very incremental. Sometimes it seems not to move at all, and it can revert. It is very difficult to diagnose a stage of reconciliation at any moment of time. My own information is largely based on the research I did for this presentation, also on all the experience I have because I was working in the Ministry of Defense, starting with Srebrenica. I got there just the days of Srebrenica, up to 1999 to the Stability Pact. Afterwards, I did my habilitation on Kosovo, crisis prevention, international crisis prevention on Kosovo. up to 2004-05, and I worked for an institute in Bonn where I was responsible for the Balkans, for European, for starting European studies programs all over the region. So I traveled through all of the region at that point of time. But since that time, I have had to do lots of other things. I'm still interested in it, but I'm not completely following. So be a little bit, keep this in mind. Next point, the sources on this topic are incomplete and they are contradicting. Key findings are disputed, and I try to present what I perceive as the consensus I see in the literature. I cannot present hard empirical data, but will work through my own experience. Fourth point, we have two levels of reconciliation, and I think it's important to distinguish the official level and the civil society level. I think it is easier to get a grip of the official level, because this is more visible. The civil society level, you always get small glimpses. There's field research and so on, but this is fragmented, and we got to be very careful to claim we know what's really going on, because we have to look in the heads of people, and this is very difficult. Next point, I do see in the research a weakness. One weakness is that it's strongly normative. It is not objective, or the starting point is already very normative, and so also disputable, the results. And what I'm missing is that that we are just starting to develop systematic academic efforts to develop indicators measuring the effectiveness. And this is what we are all thinking about, effectiveness of reconciliation. What does it lead to? How successful are we? And last point, the Balkans are a very diverse and fragmented region. And we have several reconciliation processes running side by side, sometimes also one after the other. We cannot, and I cannot trace all of them. They are multifaceted. And I will focus mainly on Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, and I'm very much willing to discuss especially Croatia and Macedonia afterwards in our discussion. The result of this is that I feel quite uncertain about my own results, and I invite you really to share your own experiences and voice alternative views of what I say. Okay, what is reconciliation for me? I want to give you just some transparency here. For me, this is more than, doesn't move, let me see. Oops, sorry, there is a, can anyone help me with the assistance? There's something here I cannot get away. Ah, maybe it works now. Let's see, it works, yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, so what is reconciliation for me? Reconciliation for me is more than negative peace and more than mere coexistence. But it's less than a state of harmony. It is less than forgiving. This might be the end state, but this is a process. Yeah? My definition, which I'm just offering, is it is a process of rebuilding relations between victims and perpetrators by confronting the past and by allowing trust to grow with the goal of preventing a renewed outbreak of conflict and attain what you might call sustainable, positive, whatever peace, lasting peace. There are two dimensions in there. There is the forward-looking dimension in there, which is, I think, trust building. Forward-looking is mainly trust building, including, for example, changing images of the self and of others, ending stereotyping. The backward-looking part is truth-seeking, changing historical narratives and myth, rewriting school books, arresting people, and so on. The latter is close to transitional justice, the term that is normally used in political science, and I've just given a definition here of the International Center for Transitional Justice that is often cited. For me, there are, if you look at criteria of effectiveness of reconciliation, if you want to, of success, there is one overarching one, which is rebuilding relationships. And this is split into two parts. One is confronting the past, truth-seeking, and the other is growth of trust across ethnicities. Ethnicities in this case, and of course not South Africa. What is important is to see that reconciliation takes a lot of time. It is a process going through different stages. It is very fragile, and it can fail. And I want to show you two slides which I got from conflict studies, which demonstrate that we have huge and increasing problems with the recurrence of conflict. Conflicts increasingly breaking out again. Here you have the blue line and the red line. The blue line shows those conflicts that are erupting without a history before. The red ones are the ones who have a history and who were outbreaking before the last 10 years before. What you see here is that, and I have unfortunately only until 2007, but as far as I know it goes on, what the scholars wrote in later articles, is that the red line is increasingly dominant. Especially in the 2000s, you see that more and more conflicts erupt again. So they seem to be solved and they erupt again. This is a worldwide trend. And you have another slide, or I have another slide showing this clearly. If you look at the red becoming more and more dominant. Yeah? So reconciliation in this respect is extremely crucial. If reconciliation fails, we see the more and more red. So how can we avoid this kind of resumption of conflict? These are the enduring rivalries I was talking about one of the last sessions. Now, if we want to understand reconciliation, and I think this was mentioned, we have to look at the post-conflict setting. We have to link what the past and the present. And the present strongly impacts on the progress of reconciliation. Maybe it's even more important than the past. The socioeconomic situation, the power distribution, the interests of local and international actors, and so on. What is the specific situation we find the Balkans in? We see a tribal transition. The Balkans have to master the transition from autocracy to democracy. This is the same in Central Eastern Europe. But we have a time lag. We have delayed. We have 9 years at least lost because of the wars. And we have a result of extreme socioeconomic problems, of weak institutions, and of fragile democratization. And this, of course, seriously hampers reconciliation. Second, we have a transition from one federal state, excluding Albania, to a group of neighboring sovereign states, newly arriving states on the international scene, all of them state building and nation building. And nation building goes along with finding their own identity. And if you define your own identity, you often do it in comparison and in opposition to others. You define yourselves and you're different from others, like the Croats from the Serbs, and so on. Which means that nation building often involves separating from others, which hampers also reconciliation. Third point, we experience, of course, the transition from war to peace. The Balkans have to master a legacy of a horrendous war. It is a horrendous war which takes place not often, involving genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And I don't want to give you the figures. They are all disputed, as you know. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, but you know what we are talking about. And we are especially talking about some of the things that are still going on, like the missing people still searching for their dead. We are still have the burials, the exhumations. We have the kids who are still stepping on mines and so on, so it's still present. And we have all the psychological dimensions still there of the memories of the past. This is different from the Caucasus. Especially it is different from the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was largely peaceful and didn't experience this kind of violence. Together with this transition from war to peace, we have to see that this was a regional war setting. Regional, which means we have several wars going on at the same time and sequentially. We have wars within countries and among countries, inter and intrastate wars. And I have to take a minute at least to explain to you what kind of wars we had, just to give you an overview where we come from. So here you see, let me just step up and see. So the first one was Slovenia in 1991 to secede from Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia, especially Serbia, reacted with bringing in the Yugoslav People's Army, 11 days of war in 1991. Afterwards, the Brioni peace agreement, it was just a ceasefire. Then we had Croatia splitting off with, again, the Yugoslav People's Army, also in 1991, intervening. That was the second stage. It was both a war between those two and within Croatia, because I think it's the white parts, Krajina and Slavonia, were splitting off the Serb-held territories. Some of you know this, but for others it might be new. The third conflict was within Bosnia and with Serbia and Montenegro. As you know, Bosnia in 1992 started the war fighting. Serbia and Montenegro, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, intervened in order to stop, especially, and to protect the Serb minority. We had the Bosniak and Croat war within the war, and this lasted until 1995 up to date. The fourth war was the war on Kosovo. Kosovo we have here. Kosovo was the war within Serbia and within Kosovo. It was the war between Serbia and Kosovo and the Kosovo Albanians in 1999 and 1998. And it was the war within Kosovo between the Serb minority and the Albanians. There, 90% of the population, as you know. And then we had the fifth war, which was within Macedonia, the northwestern part, here this part, which split off in 2001. Some don't call it war, however you call it, at the end at least was the Ohrid Agreement. Each of those agreements were agreements which were promulgated by the international community. This was a mediation by NATO and the European Union. So 5 wars. And these wars are, and I will talk about this later, all interdependent. You cannot just look at them individually. And this makes it completely very difficult. It was a regional war setting. Okay, next point, instruments. What instruments were used to come to promote reconciliation? And here I would like to, whoops, I have to look here at this. Sorry, it is, yes. Here I would like to refer to a diagram which was developed by Engbert and Jenschke, which I find helpful, from 2011. And I modified it and put in those instruments which I think are relevant for our case. So what we have here, we have a tension between, on the one hand, transition, stability, however you call it, the transition process after war, and the goals that go with this, like economic reconstruction and so on, political stability. And here you have justice, the justice goal. And in between we find ourselves in post-conflict societies. Justice is more victim-oriented. Transition is more, if you want so, perpetrator-oriented. I'll talk about this in a minute. Here we have the focus first on retributive justice. Then we have the restoration of relations, more here. And here we have minimal or no justice going along, especially with amnesia. You talked about this yesterday. These are the instruments I would like to mention, and I will skip some of them and just very briefly mention them, but I would like to stress especially this one, and this. Okay, so let's start with the most important one, which was most prominent, which is the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, which was created in 1993 by the UN Security Council during the war with the aim of, if you want so, deterring further atrocities. 1995, Srebrenica, this clearly failed. Up to 1994, 95, no indictments. 94, first indictments. 1995, the first people were arrested and transferred to the tribunal. This was the first criminal court since Nuremberg and Tokyo in 1945. It was an ad hoc tribunal. It triggered the whole upsurge of efforts to institutionalize and promote international justice. 1 year later came the tribunal for Rwanda, and so on. I don't think I have to mention all of them now. This was a great experiment. Nuremberg and Tokyo were occupation regimes. So it was easy to arrest the people. Here you needed now for the first time state cooperation, voluntary state cooperation. And there was a lot of skepticism. Will they arrest them? Will they extradite them? Will they open their archives? Might it just be a fig leaf for inaction of the international community? The initiative was by George Bush Sr., and he was highly disturbed about the way the war was going, and he wanted to stop them. This was the last month of his administration. It was kind of his attempt to do something good to stop these wars from going on. The response to these wars was retributive, not restorative at this point of time. It is important to keep this in mind. It was top-down and it was region-wide, not individual countries. Deal with all the crimes of the region. What about state compliance? My second point. The ICTY depends, as I said, on voluntary state compliance. Governments are crucial as it is called, surrogate enforcers. The ICTY has only soft power to persuade. The cooperation of local governments did not come forward for a long time. Still, the ICTY, if you just look at figures, has been a success story. We have 161 indictments, 2/3 of them Serbs, including heads of state and highest political and military leaders. It established a record of war based on concrete evidence. There was a lot of truth finding. We have finalized almost all of the trials. 14 are still ongoing, especially Karadzic, Mladic, and Šešelj, for those who know those people. It is expected to close down in 2001, and we even have the first head of state, Milosevic, being tried in 2001. So this is quite successful. There was this stimulated an institutionalization of domestic war crime chambers in the individual countries. So in most countries we have these chambers. And it also stimulated a rise of civil society groups within those countries advocating accountability. Now, has this experience, this effort of truth finding and of retribution also contributed to trust building? Here I have to talk for a minute about why did governments comply? Why did they send the indicted war criminals? Most of the governments of the region saw the tribunal as illegitimate. They refused to cooperate for a long time, and they hid indicted war criminals, especially Serbia, the Serb Republic within Bosnia. The Yugoslav justice minister even called Carla Del Ponte, the chief prosecutor, in an open letter, a prostitute. Yeah? This was the way it worked. Others paid lip service to it, especially Croatia, or expected only others to be tried, especially the Bosniaks and the Kosovo Albanians. The arrests were clearly not taking place because countries or governments acknowledged the gravity of their crimes and were willing to transfer those individuals responsible. Instead, it was interests and power that were decisive as motives to arrest war criminals. This was not, or very little, about the internalization of norms of humanitarian law. It is, and we talk a lot today about this in the literature, it is the politics of international law enforcement. Crucial were the inducements and even more the coercion of external actors, especially the European Union and the US. This moved local governments into compliance, especially EU conditionality. EU conditions, if you want to become a member of the European Union, you have to do this and that. We can go into the details. This is called in the literature instrumental compliance. Compromises were necessary in order to enter the European Union. Arrests and extraditions are the result of bargaining and some say horse trading. Outcomes reflect the asymmetric bargaining power of states. Victor Peskin, in a book about the tribunal, says, without decisive international community intervention, cooperation from targeted states will rarely be forthcoming. But can reconciliation take place in such an environment? Let's turn to the local perceptions of the tribunal. They were largely negative. Why? For most of the citizens, The Hague, where the tribunal is far away, remote. Second, there was the widespread view that the tribunal exercises victor's justice. It is constituted by the West. It decided not to pursue charges against NATO in 1999 with the war. It could not, one researcher said, not bite the finger that fed it. So there is a moment of hegemony in there, a moment. Yes. Third, some perpetrators used the tribunal hearings as a platform to humiliate the victims, to propagate nationalist ideology, and to ridicule the tribunal, especially Milosevic. I have written an article about this. 2/3 of the Serbs watched the trial on TV. This had a strong impact, undermining reconciliation. There was a survey at that time taken among Serbs. 41.6% of them rated the performance of Milosevic excellent. Number 5. 20% 4, 20% 3, 5% 2, and only 11.6% said this is bad, number 1. Mark number 1. Fourth, there was a tendency to perceive the indictees as scapegoats. They are the responsible, those 161. We are not the ones. Well, they are in The Hague. Now the problem is solved. Many victims, fifth, are embittered. Is the life sentence sufficient for mass murder? What about death penalty? Why was the process so slow that some indictees either died in prison or before? Why were I4 and S4 so hesitant, the NATO troops, so hesitant to arrest indictees? And last, there is a lack of ownership of the region within the tribunal. I want to give you one quote of a Bosniak spokesman at the ICTI who said, the ICTI was more interested in, quote, courtroom battles aiming at refining international law than in the people of former Yugoslavia. They remained merely objects of the tribunal. They were never seen at their primary constituency. End of quote. So many charges of illegitimacy provide excuses to evade the reflection of one's own responsibility. It was used by many as blame games, to start blame games among the different people. Other maligning, self-glorifying. The effect on reconciliation was much more limited than thought. There's one article by Janine Natalia Clark doing interviews in Bosnia. Her result is, quote, the tribunal yielded little evidence of any positive correlation between the tribunal trials and reconciliation. Trials can only scratch the surface of culpability. I would say the tribunal did little to inspire trust building among the ethnic groups, but it did a lot in terms of confronting or facing the past, uncovering the past. Okay. Next point, reparations and compensation. This is for many citizens, victims, a litmus test. Do they mean it seriously? The international community helped victims alleviate their suffering. We talked about this yesterday. The local governments hardly. Part of the problem is socioeconomic. They simply don't have the money for reparations. But part of the problem is also the attitude of victimization. There are a few exceptions, especially concerning rape. We can talk about those afterwards. Apologies and declarations. There was a cycle of mutual apologies. Almost everyone apologized already among the Balkan countries. This was heavily attacked by nationalists and by the victims. I don't want to give you examples now. The problem is that reconciliation on the cheap? The victims are strongly distrusting. They want to see material compensation, and they miss credible signals of change. And you remember the Prime Minister Alexander Vučić at the 20th commemoration of Srebrenica just recently, how he was attacked by the victims, by the nationalists at Srebrenica. And they were displaying signs saying, quoting Vučić during the war. He was one of the warmongers at that time, where he said, for every killed Serb, we will kill 100 Bosniaks. They are showing these signs. So apologies need to be credible to restore relationships. Otherwise, they can backfire. I leave out the resolutions. I think this would be very interesting to look at the resolutions on Srebrenica, especially by Serbia and by the Republika Srpska. But we might discuss this later. I go to the TRCs, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. None. Well, one exception. One exception was a commission that was established in 2001 by the President of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, a state commission for truth and reconciliation. They couldn't agree on an agenda. They couldn't agree on the composition. They drafted very few documents. They didn't indict anyone. It ceased to exist after 2 years. Nothing else. Why did it fail? There are several reasons. I think the main reason is the blame game, is, as someone says, the competition for victimhood. We are all victims. And if you start a commission in one country, they say, why should we start? Turning to our guilt. Let's talk about the guilt of others. No country wants to go ahead. There is an initiative there was an initiative with several proposals, for example, in Kosovo 2006 for the Ahtisaari negotiations. It failed. There is a huge petition by a group calling for a regional commission. Failed so far. No interest. Civil society projects. Lots of projects have sprung up. No one has really an overview. They try to compensate for the lack of willingness of governments to confront the past, and they try to build trust across cleavages. They try to foster a culture of remembrance, as they say. They take very different forms: art installations, literature projects, media outlets. Look at the Balkan Transitional Justice website. Very interesting, Balkan Transitional Justice. Documentaries, theater plays, remembrance activities, oral history projects. We are going to start one ourselves in Kosovo in future. There are the mothers of Srebrenica, the women in black in Serbia, weekly meeting within Belgrade to commemorate the past. I could give you examples, but I leave this out. Commemoration and memorials. The Balkans today is littered with hundreds of war memorials. And we have a multitude of commemorating events all over the year. But all these commemorations, or almost all these commemorations, commemorate the own war heroes or the own victims, even suspected war criminals. And those events, commemorating events, take place with strong riot police protecting those who are commemorating. This is Srebrenica, just for you to see, Potocari. And I want to move to this one. This is Kosovo. This is the place, a shrine, as some people say in Kosovo. This is in Drenica, in the Drenica village, where in 1998, in March, February, the whole head grouping, if you want so, of the KLA, of the Kosovo Liberation Army was executed by Serbian forces. They were encircled, they were bombed, and no one left, I think except for one small kid. All families were killed at that point of time. That was the start, by the way, of the Kosovo War in 1998, not 9. And what you see is the memorial. Here you see the big memorial building. Here you see the graves of the Yashari clan, which already goes back to the fight against the Osmanic Empire. They have this kind of prestige. Here you see one of the 3 buildings which were bombed, and they left it as they were, just to see all the grenades and so on within the walls. Here you see a picture in front of, at the street where you enter this monument. It is said that 50 to 60 buses come during the week. Just there. Yeah? This is not a small shrine, this is a big thing. And you see how they are dressed. These are the Yashari brothers. And this is the big monument. So showing Yashari, I think it's a few meters high, with machine guns and so on. Can you imagine how Serbs feel about such a monument? So this is the place where Yashari, who was named after 2008, a hero of Kosovo, is where people come to, for pilgrimage. Here it says, at the sign it says, "Uncle, it's done. Independence we got." Okay. So each memorial advances its own version of historical truth. These rival memorials are an indication of the bitterness of the dispute about how many were killed and who started the violence. They reflect the political ideas of those in power and ignore the sensitivities of others. Most of them rather reinforce than heal conflict. They are divisive. There are continuing quarrels at many sites. Some are blown up at night or vandalized. Others are taken down by police. One scholar said they are ethnic divisions set in stone. The goal is to mark public spaces and territory. They are symbols of nation building. They serve primarily sectarian interests. Only very few memorials diverge from this message. Okay, I leave amnesty out. If you know amnesty, I don't know any amnesties over in Kosovo, in the Balkans. I would be that would help me to know more. Now I would like to switch to. I have to be short. Maybe I select only one of the 3. I have Serbia and Bosnia and Kosovo, and would like to give you some stock taking of where we stand. I think I select Serbia because this is most important. Serbia is really the crucial country which is connected to most, not all, of these conflicts. There is a broad consensus in the literature and in field research saying that the public in Serbia is largely silent and disengaged from debates about the past. The official policy is at best ambivalent, if not openly obstructionist. There's one very popular quote by Slavenka Drakulic, which was voiced in The Guardian in 2008, saying that the Serbs live in denial. The democratic transition of Serbia is burdened today with the official denial and lack of accountability. Many historical facts are, in fact, known by privately known, but they are disputed in their interpretation, and there's very little public acknowledgement. Crimes are portrayed by many as legitimate defense of the national interest. A survey from 2010 said that 55.2% believe that reports about atrocities in Srebrenica are exaggerated, with malign intent by the foes of Serbia. There is a book on which did 7 opinion surveys in 4 cities of Yugoslavia between 1997 and 2005, and they conclude, quote, either complete denial of the possibility that our side engaged in atrocities or refusal to label such activities as criminal. End of quote. Of course, this is rejected by the pro-European elites. But those elites are still a minority within Serbia. Nenad Dimitrijevic has divided 3 groups. There are the obstructionists, those who are minimizing or denying the war crimes. They talk about national honor and the crimes of others. They are obstructing the arrest of criminals and the transfer of indictees. Karadzic lived in Belgrade until his arrest 2008. He lived there, just among the people. In the city of Belgrade, you can buy T-shirts and calendars of Karadzic and Mladic, or of their emblems. There's the second group of pragmatists. Let's close the history books and look ahead. And there are the reformists. They face the past, but they don't want to risk the political stability on the way. Like Zoran Djindjic, who was killed in 2003, as you know. Nenad Dimitrijevic is pessimistic. The first group won out, he said. Serbia has become, he said, a prisoner of the past. The regime change of 2000 did hardly change the perception of the past, and the constitutional and ideological setup is still very much the same as the old. The narratives about this victimized Serbian nation have survived. There is the focus on the future, but not on the past. This breeds distrust among the victims, within the European Union, and among the neighbors. Many local NGOs, though, press in their campaigns for public acknowledgement and breaking the silence. There is critique. Some people say there is silent knowing, as they call. Silent knowing. People know, but they don't want to talk about it for different reasons. For example, there is no need to be verbalized, or it is not possible to verbalize it. They find it too horrible to talk about it. Some personal experiences diverge from the official presentations. Some NGOs some argue that NGOs, with their very direct accountability campaigns, they silence the public because they are just too offensive. So there are different reasons why this might be the case. Okay, as I said, I skipped Bosnia and Kosovo, and we can go into there. What are the major obstacles for reconciliation? The first, I think, is a structural one. I said at the beginning, these are regional wars. Or to be even more precise, I would call this a regional conflict cluster. It is a cluster of conflicts, which means that these wars I showed you at the map are interdependent and they are overlapping. They are Stefan Tröbst, one of the leading scholars, historians on the region, talks concerning Albanians and Macedonians, and I think this is true for the whole region, about communicating tubes. They are like communicating tubes, which means that there are various kinds of spillovers. And I can't talk about all these spillovers. But this is like the Near East. Like with Palestine and Israel, we have lots of conflicts around, and each one is impacting the others. And it's not like the Caucasus, because in the Caucasus we have Armenia and Azerbaijan quite detached from the conflict within Georgia. These are two different things. There is very little interaction between both. And the effectiveness of reconciliation efforts is likewise interconnected. So if there is violence, if there is a backslash in one country, this spills over to the others, especially because of the ethnic composition of the region. So we have to take into account the transborder nature of the reconciliation processes, and I don't see literature on this. The second point is the wars ended with peace agreements, sometimes only with ceasefires, which succeeded to end violence, but they were mainly about negative peace, not positive peace, or very little positive peace. They hardly managed to lay the foundation for anything resembling positive peace. They were the product of strong international pressure. They aimed at finally ending these atrocities. Relief, we got it. But they did not open the path towards, or very little, the path towards reconciliation. Maybe a little bit more in Ohrid than before, so Macedonia. They required power sharing of the former adversaries. And we have a big debate, is power sharing possible in these kind of war-torn societies? Is power sharing really the solution? We might talk about this later. Within those agreements, there are hardly any stipulations on reconciliation or transitional justice. They excluded major spoilers, like the Bosnian Serbs in Dayton, and they left major groups dissatisfied and revisionist. And the peace agreements are overall still highly contested and fragile. Third point, one of the major impediments for reconciliation are these open status issues. I think we talked about them the last days. The future of Bosnia is still open. The Serbs are still threatening a referendum of independence. The future of Kosovo is still open. Serbia has not recognized up to now Kosovo. The future of northern Kosovo is still open because Mitrovica is completely detached, which is one town, northern Mitrovica, and is waiting for the time that Kosovo is partitioned and that northern Mitrovica becomes part of Serbia. So there are strong secessionist ambitions which impede reconciliation. And there is this also this independent. There is also the independence of Macedonia, strongly disputed by Greece. These ongoing struggles over identity, territory, borders, and statehood, they create uncertainty. They push adversarial identity formation, and they breed conflict and not reconciliation. They also don't allow investment, because people don't come under such situations. Next point, reconciliation is easier when you really have a clear break with the past, like in Germany, like in South Africa. In the Balkans, you have so much continuity, especially among the elites. Franjo Tuđman and Slobodan Milosevic were in power until the year 2000. 9 years after starting the war. Serbia has still no constitution different from the one of the wartime. Karadzic was in power in the Republika Srpska until 1997, 2 years after Dayton. The major war criminal. Haradinaj and Taci, two of the leaders of the Kosovo Albanians, were prime ministers or presidents. Taci was president between 2008 and 2014. He was the leader and one of the founders of the KLA. He lived in Vinica, where this is. Yeah, he comes from there. He has been one of the major commanders. I interviewed him personally. Yeah, very dubious. He was involved in organized crime, all that stuff, including organ crime, trafficking. In Macedonia, many of the leaders today, I researched the roots of the KLA. They are the founders of the KLA in Kosovo, and they are still in power and leading leaders of the Albanian parties there. These elites, during the wars, legitimized their own actions by constructing malign others, externalizing a stigma, if you want so, other maligning. They glorified themselves, and they portrayed other ethnicities, their own ethnicity exclusively as victims. Self-whitewashing, it is sometimes called. Some, like the Serbs, also externalized all responsibility by fabricating an enemy image of the West, especially of NATO. And this kind of continuity is problematic, especially in Serbia as the core state, due to its size, its dominance within Yugoslavia, and its involvement in the conflicts. The legacy of the Milosevic regime impedes coming to terms with the past within Serbia and breeds strong distrust within the region. And this goes along with a lack of leadership, of visionary leadership, like Desmond Tutu, like Konrad Adenauer, like Robert Schuman and others. We don't have them. I don't see them, at least. Maybe Zoran Djindjic was one, but he was killed in 2003 by people who feared that he would bring them to trial in The Hague. Yeah? So we are missing leadership. There's one other factor which I found very interesting in the literature. Some say the fact that this is about genocide impedes reconciliation. Why? Because genocide is perceived as the crime of crimes, as the worst. And no one wants to be tagged a genocidal nation. And so they are doing everything to avoid getting this tag. This stimulates denial. You talked yesterday about, Philip, about minimalist and maximalist approaches. Within the region and among the international community, there is a minimalist approach towards reconciliation. Not only among the governments of the region, but also among the international actors. There were, at the beginning, minimal efforts of the UN troops during the war and of NATO troops after the war, and I was very frustrated within the government that so little happened to capture the war criminals. We knew where they are, I was sure. But no one wanted to get there. Everyone feared this would start riots and whatever. In the name of political stability, avoiding nationalist backslash, avoiding that the elections would bring back the nationalists, the main reason why conditionality, EU conditionality policy was very vague and ambivalent was because they feared that the next elections will bring the nationalists to power again. What can you do? So it is a pragmatic policy focusing on the imperatives of the current situation, fearing that too strong a focus on the past might derail the political stabilization today. Two more reasons. I talked about the instrumental understanding of reconciliation by the local governments. Most of them perceive reconciliation as something imposed by others from the outside. And they comply with it mainly because only if the benefits in terms of EU accession or financial aid exceed the costs of giving up the wall of silence and denial and of facing the resistance of national constituencies. So they have costs, and they are comparing costs and benefits. and say they see a lot of costs. The result is the policy of a lack of internalization of basic human rights norms. The last point, maybe the early focus on retributive justice by the tribunal was counterproductive. Because it created, I would say, path-dependent effects. It neatly divided the roles between the internationals who are coercing the locals to change and the locals who can withdraw and say, okay, we only comply if necessary, and evade accountability. At the beginning, I asked, where do we stand regarding reconciliation after 20 years of Dayton? Has reconciliation failed? I think the answer depends on, do we see the glass half empty or half full? The pessimists can point to the prevalence of denial, to the unwillingness of many to confront the past, I'm coming to an end, in politics and publics, the lack of empathy, and the quest to cultivate one's own victimhood. The optimists can point to the cycle of apologies throughout the Balkans, the willingness, even though under pressure, to arrest and extradite all war criminals indicted by the tribunal. And they can point to the manifold civil society projects, especially in Serbia, I would say much less in Kosovo, and also in Bosnia less. Each one of those reconciliation processes is at a different stage. Overall, I think we have done better in truth-seeking than in trust-building. Concerning trust-building, we are just in the very early stages of rebuilding broken relationships. We should not forget that Germany, though, also needed many decades to build trust again with its neighbors. And this you will talk about more after our break. It took time to accept the tribunal of Nuremberg and to say, yes, this was good. First, everyone said, no, we don't want this. It took time to come to a trusting new relationship with Israel, France, and others. But do we have the time? How much time do we have still? I don't know. There was a report by Amnesty International in 2014 titled Serbia Ending Impunity for War Crimes Under the International Law, which deplored that only 160 perpetrators have been tried before the Special War Crimes Court in Belgrade. And it argues, I quote, "The next few years are crucial in tackling the climate of impunity in Serbia. Time is passing. Witnesses are dying. Memories are fading. Perpetrators of war crimes must urgently be tried to ensure victims receive justice before it is too late." And this is my end. Okay.